Well, hey there. If you love the gospel story and the kind of art that stirs your soul, you're one of us already. So why not make it official? Join the Rabbit Room membership. By becoming a member, you'll be a partner in everything we create. Books, articles, events, and even podcasts, just like the one you're listening to right now. Plus, you'll enjoy exclusive perks throughout the year, and we'll even send you our classic member mug as our way of saying thank you. Join us today, or learn more at rabbitroom.com/membership. Have you ever wondered what might happen if someone mashed up The Princess Bride with Calvin and Hobbes? Oh, wow! So have we. Doesn't everyone? Well, thankfully, comic artist Johnny Jimison has arrived to satisfy this very specific itch with his graphic novel series, The Dragon Lord Saga. In vivid color and high adventure, you can join Martin, the stable boy, and Marco, his well-intentioned brother, as they embark on an epic story full of bandits and dragons, danger and humor, brotherhood and villainy, and just one, sarcastic talking horse. The third volume of this graphic novel saga, Dragons and Desperados, is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the Rabbit Room store or your favorite bookseller and discover the secrets of the Dragon Lord today.
So one of the things that I've learned since the book's come out is that ordinary for a lot of people is a code word for something. But I really think everyone experiences the ordinary, whether you are a stay-at-home mom or a stunt driver. I wrote this book in part because I, was a 20-something that kind of wanted to, change the world or at least a part of it and live adventurously, and had no idea what daily life, why that would matter to God, or what spiritual formation and discipleship looked like in ways that weren't kind of flashy or emotional or big or life-changing or world-changing.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. In this archive edition of the Habit Podcast, we're going all the way back to the first season in 2019, and one of my favorite of the almost 300 episodes of this podcast. It's a three-way conversation between Tish Harrison-Warren, Doug McKelvey, and me. Tish is an Anglican priest, a former columnist for the New York Times and Christianity Today, a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, and the author of Prayers in the Night and the Liturgy of the Ordinary. Doug is best known as the author of the Every Moment Holy books. In this episode, Tish and Doug and I talk about the liturgies of the writing life, finding meaning where it is to be found, and liturgy as a way of making room for mystery to assert itself. Tish Harrison-Warren, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Doug McKelvey, I'm so glad you're here too.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
We thought it'd really be fun to get you two in the same conversation, not the same room, because Tish is at home and Doug is here with me. Because Doug's book, Every Moment Holy, is a book of liturgies. Tish, your book, Liturgy of the Ordinary, obviously is very concerned with liturgy. And it seems like people who go looking for one book sometimes end up with the other book as well. And so I would just love to hear y'all talk about some of the commonalities between the work you do, and I just think this is going to be, I think, interesting things are going to happen with the two of you in conversation. I want to start with the idea of the ordinary. I mean, Tish, that's in the title of your book, and it certainly is an important idea in Doug's book. The idea that you're both calling readers to pay attention to the ordinary. In the belief, in the faith, in the confidence that that the ordinary things of the world are holy, are shot through with meaning. So, and also, by the way, I think that's a good posture for a writer, right? That's a spiritual posture, certainly, but it's also a writerly posture.
So one of the things that I've learned since the book's come out is that ordinary for a lot of people is a code word for something. Often it's a code word for, oh, okay, so this is about being a stay-at-home mom, or this is about being boring, or this is about, being in your 40s with a mortgage as opposed to in your 20s, or a famous person, or a person that makes an impact on the world. But I really think everyone experiences the ordinary, whether you are a stay-at-home mom or a stunt driver. That becomes the stunt driver's ordinary, right? It's their life, and so I wrote this book in part because I, was a 20-something that kind of wanted to change the world, or at least a part of it, and live adventurously, and had no idea what daily life, why that would matter to God, or what spiritual formation and discipleship looked like in ways that weren't kind of flashy or emotional or big or life-changing or world-changing. So I hit in my 30s a period where, my husband was in grad school. We were living in Nashville. And I just had no idea how to find meaning and how to seek God in my actual lived life. It was sort of seeking God was a fantasy for a different kind of life than the one I was actually living. And so sort of out of that, I wrestled a lot for many, many years. And then many, many years later, I wrote this book, sort of pulling from a lot of things that I had learned over those years. But in general, when I say ordinary, I just mean the stuff that makes up your actual life, what you actually do with your day. So what you do in your first 2 hours of your day or last 2 hours of your day, what you do for your work, what you do with your neighbors and your friends, which we all have. I mean, the President of the United States has to brush his teeth. So, or we hope so that he does anyway. So no one escapes the ordinary.
Yeah. Doug, I know you've done some thinking about the ordinary. I mean, you've written 2 liturgies that I know of about changing diapers. I don't know how many others you've written.
Yeah, I'm trying to create a new subgenre. What Tish said does resonate with me a lot in my own experience, from the standpoint that I grew up in traditions where there was actually not a lot of tradition, but in subcultures where there was a lot of talk about doing great things for God, and a lot of pressure for, to have some sort of international, worldwide, miraculous ministry. And anything less wasn't really worth thinking about. And at a certain point in my young adult life, suddenly coming to a place where that all ground to a halt, and it was like my ship struck an iceberg, and that iceberg was the realization that I don't know how to love people. I have never been a good friend to anyone. I have not been a good son or brother. I just fundamentally have this problem where I can't maintain relationships, and my first calling, if I'm going to follow Jesus, is to learn to love people. And if God ever wants to do something else beyond that through my life, that's fine. But I need to just concentrate on this lifelong goal of trying to become someone who loves people more like Jesus does. So I think that idea of coming to realize that our life is made up of ordinary moments, and that the only people we can serve and love are those who are actually in our lives, that our lives are rubbing up against each other in some capacity. So what you were saying, Tish, it took me back to that part of my own experience.
Yeah, so deeply resonate with everything Doug just said. And I should say, actually, funny enough, just this is a total aside, but I actually don't own a copy of my book right now because I gave my last copy away, but I have Doug's book on my coffee table. So I own his book and not my own book. But to bring it, I'm well aware that I feel like I didn't address the writing part of your question. And so I'll say that I think, so I was really wrestling with ideas of live as a formation of the way daily life forms us. And some around the same time, I took, I'm an Anglican priest. I'm a pastor. I worked in campus ministry. So I loved to write. I wrote a lot, but I never thought, I'm going to be a writer. This is going to be my career. At this point, it's my career. I mean, it's the main gig I do, but that it's sort of, I stumbled into it, and writing found me way more than I found writing in many ways. Like I wasn't looking for it, but so my writing started, I took a poetry class. I took a poetry writing course. There was a, Middle Tennessee University had a little, like graduate level, you could take writing courses there. And I really it was a total lark, just wanted to take this class in writing poetry, and really, really loved it. But the reason that I did it was to notice my own life, was to take, I've never published poems, so it didn't lead to,
Right.
I've never even tried to publish poems, but maybe I should. But it was, writing began for me as a way to notice what was happening in my actual world. I was young. I was at the top of my 20s and bottom of my 30s. I was pregnant with my first child, and I felt like my life was changing, and I needed to look at it. I needed to kind of hold it close and notice it. And so that was how writing, with that poetry class, and then a friend of mine who had a online magazine called The Well that InterVarsity put out, asked me to write for it. And essentially I started writing just about my own life. It was very slice of life. It was very like, what am I learning in my actual life today? So I feel like now, I just wrote a piece for Christianity Today. They asked me to write about the Via Media, which is a very ideas-heavy piece, but writing didn't start for me about ideas. It really started about noticing what was happening in front of me.
So could one of you make the connection between the idea of the ordinary on the one hand and the idea of liturgy on the other? I'm not sure that's self-evident to everybody who hasn't read your books, who's not familiar with your work, of why, for instance, Tish, you would speak of the liturgy of the ordinary. What's the connection?
Well, for me, liturgy is simply those things that we do, the stuff that we do, the practices in our life that form us. So that certainly is formal liturgical liturgy on Sunday morning. But that's also like, compulsively picking up your smartphone is a liturgy. And I don't know, we have liturgies around our family life. We just started school again and entered this routine, and it's liturgical, right? It's like it's a liturgy of our time, of our year. So, when I was wrestling with these questions of how does ordinary life matter, there was this whole spate of Christian books for a while that were like all about ordinary and how they mattered and how God meets you in your regular, boring life, which was great. They're actually good books, and I benefited from them. But I kept saying, like, why? This can't just be, I don't want just this to be another piece of information that I like hold in my head. My ordinary life matters, like to, put on a sign on the wall or something to remind me. I wanted to understand. And so the answer for me was formation, that this is the place that we are formed. And a lot of it has to do with the name of your podcast, with the idea of habit, that these are the things that kind of make us. And so most of our life, I would say, is lived by liturgies, daily liturgies. And some of those form us to more beautifully to give and receive love, and some of those malform us. And so my book is a lot about wrestling with what are the things that form us in our daily life.
When I first moved to Nashville in the early 90s, mercifully, I ended up very quickly plugged into the art house community that Charlie Peacock and his wife Andy had just formed, that nonprofit. And one of the things that Charlie was really discussing at the time was the idea of coram deo, of all of life lived out under the gaze of God, and there being no divide between sacred parts and secular parts, but that all of it alike belonged to God and was lived under his gaze and should be part of our act of worship. And those ideas were new to me and became very formational as I was just at the point of beginning to rebuild a theology that was actually more scriptural and made more sense than what I had grown up with that ultimately fell apart. And so in writing Every Moment Holy, one of the underlying ideas of it is the hope of being able to communicate to people that coram deo idea, that we might tend to think of just church services as liturgical, or certain ceremonies for baptism and marriage and those sorts of things. But the reality is, as Tish was saying, that everything that we do that forms the rhythms of our lives is formational to who we are. And my hope was to help bridge that gap for people in their understanding that Charlie was so instrumental in helping to bridge for me and mine when I was in my 20s, that everything matters. It's all part of that act of worship, and all parts of our lives can be offered to God and considered in light of his truth and his Spirit at work within us.
Yeah. Tish, you used the word formation, and it made me think about you have a chapter about making your bed. Just that simple habit of getting up in the morning and making your bed.
Yes, which I do not always do still, even though it's in the book. I sometimes do it, though. Yeah.
Of course, this is a podcast about writing, and I think that idea, these ideas of, on the one hand, paying attention to what's right in front of you, instead of thinking I've got to say something fabulous or something nobody's ever said before or whatever. I think that's super important. And then also just this idea of the habits, the liturgy of every day, trusting the process, sitting down, doing. I mean, this is. I think that's what you mean by formation. Tish, just the idea of doing these little habits that making your bed once isn't going to make any difference in your life, but doing it every morning eventually does.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I talk about that in the book, that I never made my bed. I mean, never. I didn't, and I say this in the book, but it was true. Like, it hadn't occurred to me that grown-ups did this, made their bed when there was no parent to make them do this.
Yeah.
And which just speaks to the state of my home. So I would often wake up and immediately go to my smartphone, which that no longer does, but used to sit, on my bedside table. And so I would look at the news. So the very first moments of the day were imprinted by technology and news and entertainment and newstainment, which is kind of sort of all of our news now. And and so I had no space for the actual embodied world that I was in, noticing the weather outside, what I was feeling in my body or hearing outside. I had no space for silence. And so that chapter on bed making isn't so much about, keeping your house clean, because I will not be able to write that book. But it's about learning these very small practices that change the course of our day, really subtle things that point us to something larger than ourselves, or point us in a different direction than just my sort of natural habits and natural inclinations would be. And I definitely think that there's a book on habit that I can't actually even remember, but I know that there's this concept in it of sort of super habits, or habits that shape all our other habits. Bed making may even be mentioned as one of those, but writing, I think the arts of any sort, is definitely one of those that writing is something that you have to sort of take up as a habit, that you have to kind of do over and over again, or at least give some real time to. And that habit is going to shape the rest of your day, shape the way you see the rest of your day as you're going through it. I mean, and also shape your actual time. But I feel like when I started writing, we had really little kids. And so I had basically an hour and a half every morning that my husband would take the kids and I could write. And that was it. That was all I was going to write that day. And so, and that was 4 days a week. So I had just over, whatever that is, 10 hours in a week. And that was going to be all. So so my life was shaped around that habit and thinking about what I was going to write the next day, what I was going to do. And now that I actually have more time and write more full time, it's actually kind of, in some ways, hard. I think I get some less done in some ways, because it's easy to go, well, I'll write in an hour or so. And so that sort of habituation of time, I think, changes us as writers. But also the practice of writing changes how you walk around in the world, how you grocery shop and do everything else you do. It kind of shapes who you are.
Yeah. One of the connections that's important to me between the habits of writing and the liturgy, more properly speaking, or if that's the right way to say it, is that there are mysteries about writing. There are things that happen when I sit down to write that I don't understand. I don't understand what's going on, and I have no control over those things. But what I do have control over is actually sitting down and actually putting, So I can. Those habits that I do have some sort of control over create room and space for these mysteries to assert themselves, which I think is a really important part of. I mean, I know it's a really important part of what y'all are talking about.
I absolutely love that idea so much. James Bryan Smith, in his book, The Good and Beautiful God, his first chapter is about sleep as a spiritual practice. And one of the things he says is that sleep teaches us about all spiritual practices, and that you can't make yourself sleep. You can only create the conditions under which you might fall asleep.
Yes.
But you can't actually rest on your own. I mean, that has to sort of be received as a gift. And I talk about that a little bit in the last chapter of my book. But I very consistently in writing write things I don't know I knew. And and there's so I love what you had to say about, I do think there's this mystery to it of my husband, who's an academic writer, doesn't understand what I mean by that, but that is very consistently, I feel like I'm learning as I'm writing, and there is this kind of entering into something that I don't control, but we're creating those conditions where that might happen.
Yeah.
And you kind of beg God. And Walker, I remember reading Walker Percy. Every day he sat in his office from 9 to 12, he said. And sometimes he would write a lot and do really well, and sometimes it wouldn't go well. But he said you kind of had to get to the point where you gave up and just begged God to throw you a bone so that, so that, you know, this isn't the last thing you said isn't going to be the last thing you ever say. Yeah. So there is the sense of you sit there in your office and you just, throw yourself on the mercy of God. Yeah. And he said, you know, his wife could always tell how well writing went by when he came out at noon, if he was sweaty or not. And he said when he wrote this lately, his life problem is that he hasn't ever been sweaty coming out of his office. But anyway, wow. So he just sat there. And waited.
So when he was productive, he got sweaty, or when he was unproductive, he was sweaty?
When he was productive, he got sweaty.
That's funny. Just a couple of weeks ago, on a recent episode of The Habit, Jessica Hooten Wilson told me that Walker Percy also watched soap operas and The Incredible Hulk.
That's awesome.
You know, I've spent the last few minutes looking for something on my phone, and I finally found it. But it's where my mind went when you asked that last question, and this is a short Celtic prayer. It's I doubt this title was actually attached to it when it was written during the heyday of Celtic Christianity, but the title on it is Praying with the Spirit. But I've just been struck with how insightful and penetrating the thoughts of this anonymous author were hundreds of years ago. Sometimes when I pray, I utter the words, but I do not feel or think them. Sometimes when I pray, I utter the words, thinking about what I say, but not feeling. Sometimes when I pray, I utter the words, and I both think and feel what I say. An act of will cannot make me feel, nor stop my mind from wandering. An act of will can only make me utter. So I shall utter the words, and let the Spirit do the rest, guiding my mind and heart as He wills.
Wow.
That's so beautiful.
But I spent so long trying to find that I forgot what the tie-in was to the question.
No, it ties in perfectly. It's this idea that we sort of show up with our like little tiny tools, whatever they are, like prayer, your keyboard, and then you're waiting grace. I mean, you're waiting God to move.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And it's healthy to acknowledge that there are mysteries at work, but it's not especially helpful to spend all your time wondering when the mystery is going to assert itself. And when, you're better off just sitting down and doing it.
Yeah.
And hoping for the best.
Yeah. And also mystery can look really ordinary too. You know, I completely believe that mystery is at work. And sometimes mystery looks like, this has happened where I'm learning things at my computer and weeping because God is like healing me through this process of writing. But sometimes mystery can look like I am frustrated and I don't know how to make this sentence work and I don't know how to do this. But I keep working on it, and eventually through editing, something semi-coherent kind of happens. I think what I'm saying is I think there is the great mystery, but I don't want to only associate mystery with sublime experiences. Like my daughter planted garlic in our backyard yesterday, and if that garlic grows, like that's a great mystery, but it's also really, really ordinary, and she's going to have to do lots of, regular garden maintenance to do that. So, and no one's going to think it's a miracle that garlic grew from garlic, but it is kind of a miracle that things grow.
Yeah, and staying in touch with that fact that that's a miracle. That's a really healthy act for anybody, but especially for a writer. I have something I call the other people's rodents principle, and that is the rodents in your own life. You are either you don't like your own rodents. The chipmunks that burrow under my patio, I hate those chipmunks. I hate Tennessee chipmunks, but when I go to Colorado and see the little Colorado chipmunks, they're just darling. And so what got me thinking about this is there were Australian exchange students who came to my kids' school, and they went nuts over the squirrels. They thought the squirrels were the most amazing thing they'd ever seen. And these are people who lived with kangaroos at home. But because they were different, they were able to see what a miracle squirrels are. And they weren't wrong. It's just that I'm so used to squirrels that I forget.
Right. It was your ordinary.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Last question. Who are the writers who make you want to write, Tish? Doug's already had his chance, so
I want to know
his own episode.
But I didn't hear that one. Now I'm going to go back. That make me want to write. Okay.
Now, of course, this isn't the same thing as who are your favorite writers. I mean, it could be, but
yes. Yeah, you warned me of that because I have a list of my favorite writers, but I already told you this, but I'll tell your listeners. Like Flannery O'Connor we named our daughter after Flannery O'Connor and Dorothy Day. So I love them, but I don't write like Flannery O'Connor. I don't write fiction. I don't write short stories. So reading her nourishes me, but I don't think I'm going to go write about, a murder, a family murder or something. So the people who make me want to write, Annie Dillard is a huge one. She's been very influential to me. And when I read her stuff, she makes me believe that we live in a world that is wild and wondrous. And that makes me want to write. So Annie Dillard, there's poets that are really influential to me, like Scott Cairns, but I don't write poetry. I do write poetry, but I don't show it to other people. So, but
if he makes you want to go sit down and do what you do, though, that counts.
I think he does. And his prose also, like Lucy Shaw, Scott Cairns, particularly Scott, but his prose have been also really formative to me. He does a really good job of writing prose poetically. Reading him, and he's so steeped in he reads like Eastern Orthodox fathers from 2,000 years ago every single morning, and then he writes poetry about his daily life. So it's just, he really inspires me. I'm embarrassed about this one, but C.S. Lewis is so predictable, but he's huge. He's been so influential to me. I love other people's writing so much. And so in my books, I always end up with lots of people's quotes, too many quotes. So when I turned in Liturgy the Ordinary, my editor didn't have a ton of changes, but she said there's too many quotes, there's too many C.S. Lewis quotes, and too many James K.A. Smith quotes.
All right.
And then this book, I know already that next one I'm writing a book right now that's due in a month or two, And I know she's going to say there are too many C.S. Lewis quotes and too many Rich Mullins quotes. There's so many. They're in every chapter. But Rich Mullins is also one of the writers that makes me want to write. And he, not only his songwriting, but he wrote little essays that I think are beautiful and brilliant. And then also Eugene Peterson. When I read Peterson, I want to write. Those are some folks.
All right.
Anne Patchett's nonfiction work has been really, really influential to me as well. So,
all right. Well, Tish, thanks so much for being here. And Doug, thank you, too. This has been a lot of fun.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hope we can do it again soon. All right, y'all. Bye.
Bye.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.